As emo kids, we're contractually obligated to like The Nightmare Before Christmas. If you grew up in the 90s or noughties, chances are you watched this film many times when you were younger, and even more since. And the family-friendly stop-motion horror has influenced far more of your personality than you'd like to admit. For a lot of people, this was their first taste of what would become alt culture, and in many ways would define that culture on its own, both aesthetically and musically. In the US, it would breathe life into Hot Topic, and here in the UK, although we didn't really have an equivalent, HMV would always be filled with posters, stickers, mugs, t-shirts, backpacks, and basically anything else they could slap a picture of Jack and Sally on. But as much as kids were embracing the fashion, we also got one of the greatest musical soundtracks of all time. You're telling me that there's a scary sounding movie soundtrack about a big skeleton man, and demons and witches and werewolves and vampires that's also somehow a Christmas film, and was composed by the guy that made the Simpsons theme tune? And then you're telling me that 15 years later they released an album of covers of the entire soundtrack, with bands like the All-American Rejects, Rise Against, Korn, and Amy from Evanescence. So with Halloween just around the corner, we thought what better time to revisit Nightmare Revisited. The Nightmare Before Christmas was based on a short poem that Tim Burton had written while working as an animator at Disney in the 1980s. It was inspired by the classic holiday specials like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and was a macabre take on the genre inspired by the works of Dr. Seuss and Edward Gorey. He originally wanted to turn it into a children's book or a televised special, but Disney thought that it would be too disturbing and weird for young audiences. But after Burton had earned some credibility with hits like Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands, Disney let him revive the project. The original soundtrack for the film was written by Danny Elfman, who, like we already mentioned, wrote the music for The Simpsons, as well as the original soundtracks for Batman and Batman Returns, Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, and the Pee Wee Herman films. By 1993, when The Nightmare Before Christmas was released, he'd already established himself as the go-to guy if you needed a slightly creepy but whimsical soundtrack for a gothic movie directed by Tim Burton. What do you mean Tim Burton didn't direct The Nightmare Before Christmas? It says in the title, Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Burton was busy working on Batman Returns, so Disney brought in Henry Selick to direct, with Burton being kept as a producer to still have some creative input and guidance. With their history of successful collaborations, Tim brought in Elfman to compose an original score for the story that he had written, but it was really Elfman who crafted the characters and themes within the songs themselves. Tim would describe scenes to Danny, who would then write the songs based on the visuals and lyrical ideas that Burton had been collecting for over a decade. He said, "I wanted it to sound like it was written 50 or 100 years ago, so I turned to my own influences for that stuff. Kurt Weill's The Threepenny Opera, which was a major thing in my life, was a source, as well as musicals from Cole Porter and Gershwin, and to a certain extent, Rodgers and Hammerstein. I always felt Jack was a part of me. When I wrote those songs, I was in kind of a unique position, because like Jack, I was the king of my own little kingdom, and, like Jack, I really wanted a way out, but I didn't know how to get out because so many people depended on me. So my own psychological mindset at the time was that I was writing from my own perspective as much as his, because I understood what it felt like to want something else." Elfman's music for this kind of family horror film always invokes a kind of otherworldliness, being just unsettling enough to create a horror vibe, while also being jovial and fun. Like Halloween itself, it's scary, but in a fun way. When it first came out in 1993, it wasn't exactly a huge hit. It only earned a moderate $50 million in the US on its initial theatrical release, but became a cult classic during the early noughties. When it came out, Disney was in the early phases of their animated renaissance, with films like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin setting a more comfy, colourful tone. All of a sudden, here comes this weird, creepy, jagged thing. The culture of the time didn't really have a permanent home for something like The Nightmare Before Christmas, because in many ways, it was so ahead of its time. If you look at the story of Jack, you see someone stuck in a rut, someone who's become bored of doing the same old things over and over again every year, and who even says directly that he feels empty inside. This is someone who's having a bit of an identity crisis and suddenly finds this new spark of excitement that breaks him out of his depressive cycle. Suddenly he has this longing for something he doesn't really understand yet, but he knows that he wants to go on this new adventure without being able to see the consequences of his actions. He's obsessive and passionate and compulsive, but he means well, and eventually he comes to have a newfound love and respect for the person who he has always been. And then you have Sally, a girl trapped by her abusive creator who longs for freedom, for autonomy, and again for excitement and adventure. She feels something for Jack and wants to help him with his problems, but she also knows what the potential dangers are. Her anxiety about what could happen just gets entirely dismissed and makes her feel unheard and ignored. She is literally stitched together from old tattered bits of fabric like a patchwork doll, and often comes apart at the seams, but she is able to put herself back together time and again and take pride in her imperfections. You ask any goth, emo or alt girl if they were in some way influenced and inspired by Sally when they were younger, and most will say yes. Both of these characters were so easy for young people to get attached to and identify with, because even though Jack was written to be an allegory for Elfman's own issues around a decade earlier, that feeling of change and growth, making choices and becoming your own person, that is something that all people experience around a certain age. Jack and Sally became the embodiment of those struggles as kids were growing up in a world full of new things like the internet. But whereas the culture around the time of its initial release was soft and warm and optimistic, suddenly in the early noughties, kids were being exposed to things like 9/11 and the War on Terror. The culture felt like it was ready for something a bit darker, a bit less safe, a bit more edgy. And so The Nightmare Before Christmas became something that spoke to a lot of kids who were growing up around the start of the 2000s with all this angst, trying to find out who they were in a world that was changing so quickly. Kids who were changing out of their old habits and starting to look for new things to do and new things to be. Suddenly, because of the internet, they could talk to people all over the world and discover all these new things and communities. And one of those things that brought people together was The Nightmare Before Christmas. This weird stop-motion film that looked like it was for kids, but it was dark and mysterious too. And it was all wrapped up in a spooky, fun tone that fit right alongside the kind of music that these kids were discovering at the same time. Because while this film was being discovered by the new audience that made it the global success that it is today, bands like Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance and Panic at the Disco were breaking out and dominating the charts with this new style of emo music that was heavy but fun. The lyrics were depressing and deep, but the music itself was big and loud and theatrical, and that's what The Nightmare Before Christmas really is. With it being a musical written by the two men who already had this dark, twisted aesthetic to their catalogue, it had all the same elements as this new emo scene. It was dark, but it was loud. It was a performance, but it felt very real and honest. And from there, with this new audience that finally understood it, the film became a global hit. It was re-released in cinematic 3D in 2006, and to celebrate this they also re-released the soundtrack with a bonus disc of covers and demos. Danny Elfman's original recordings for Making Christmas, Oogie Boogie's song, Kidnap the Sandy Claus and This Is Halloween were featured alongside covers of some of the most popular songs on the soundtrack. Fall Out Boy's bassist Pete Wentz said, "Disney approached our management about us doing a song, and we're obsessed with that film and Danny Elfman. And of course I've got my Nightmare tattoos. So we were like, yes, the songs in the film are pretty much the best things ever. They're Elfman at his prime." Other tracks included 2 covers of This Is Halloween, one by Panic at the Disco and the other being Marilyn Manson's now iconic version. Sally's song was performed by Fiona Apple, and Kidnap the Sandy Claus was transformed by She Wants Revenge from this twisted nursery rhyme into a sort of Europop rave track. It certainly found its niche fan base, and it's interesting like all covers and reworkings should be, but it does lose some of the charm and tone of the original. 2 years after this, a full album of covers was made to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the film's original release. Elfman wanted to celebrate the diversity of the music and how it could be reinterpreted by contemporary artists, so he matched the songs to select artists who he thought could add something new and interesting. Marilyn Manson's This Is Halloween was the only cover version to be carried over onto what would become Nightmare Revisited. The album starts off with a version of Overture by Devotchka. Now the original piece isn't in the film itself, but the purpose of an overture is to introduce musical themes and motifs that will appear throughout the rest of the piece. On the soundtrack it's there to introduce us to What's This and Making Christmas, the 2 most Christmas sounding tracks in the film. This reworking by Devotchka stays pretty true to the original piece, but it ramps up the chaotic feel of it and turns it into an almost circus theme, bringing back some of that Halloween feeling. It does a good job of setting the tone for the rest of the album, in that this is something that's familiar, but a little bit different to the music that you're used to, and opening with something that isn't drastically and completely new is a great way to ease people in. Then Danny Elfman himself gives us a rendition of the opening monologue of the film. Patrick Stewart had done the original version, but it was cut from the film and only featured on the soundtrack. The actual version used in the film was performed by Ed Ivory, who voices Santa Claus in the film as well. And then we get to the first real reinterpretation on the album. Marilyn Manson's version of This Is Halloween was already quite well known at this point, after being performed live on The Tonight Show's Halloween episode in 2006, just after the re-release had come out. This version was heavier than the original, darker, but still felt like the song that fans of the film had fallen in love with. Manson performed all of the vocal parts in different cadences and vocal styles to mimic the many different citizens of Halloween Town that had featured in the original. This became probably the most famous track on the entire album. Then we have the All-American Rejects version of Jack's Lament, which musically sounds different from what their style usually is, with them leaning into the Elfman kinds of sounds and instrumentation. The difference with this version though comes in the vocals. The original singing voice for Jack Skellington was, you guessed it, Danny Elfman, and because he's performing a role in a musical, his version is a lot more character driven and dynamic, but this version twists that with some fun harmonies from the band that flesh things out and make some lines sound a little bit more creepy. It's fun, but it does lose some of the character. Amina's cover of Dr. Finkelstein / In the Forest is a perfect way to take something like this and really make it your own by not changing too much. The deep stabbing strings replacing the brass from the original, with the eerie flutes and keyboards over the top, create this broad dynamic that really makes it sound a lot spookier. The original has that Elfman whimsy to it as Jack is leaving Halloween Town and ends up discovering the doors, but Amina managed to make this change still feel darker and more sinister, which is an interesting twist on the material. Then we get to what I personally think is the worst song on the album. Now I'm sorry to all you Flyleaf fans out there, but their version of What's This absolutely destroys the original. I don't even like Christmas that much, but when I hear
the fuck is in the air, the fuck, there's white shit everywhere,
it feels so magical and cozy. Jack is literally discovering Christmas and all the fun and excitement for the first time. The original song is one of the best Christmas songs ever written, but the Flyleaf version is just so drab and melancholy and boring. I know the idea was to take these songs and do something unique with them, but come on. This is the entire point of Jack's character, discovering the wonder of Christmas, and the song really doesn't do anything with that idea. The flat, monotone delivery of the iconic lines just makes it feel so depressing, literally the exact opposite of the purpose of the song, and not in that kind of way where the juxtaposition is the entire point. Just skip this one and play the Fall Out Boy version instead. The next song, the Polyphonic Sprees cover of Town Meeting, is another one that completely changes the feel of the original material, but where some of the other changes don't work, I think this one still makes things interesting at the very least. Slowing it down to this choral synth rock ballad makes it sound completely different, but still has a kind of musical theatre feel to it. This is the band that did the soundtrack for Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, so they were used to some weird and far out concepts and how to adapt them musically. I think that experience really helps here, and in lesser hands this could have been another one to skip, but the clear influences of artists like Queen, Pink Floyd and David Bowie mean that even having been extended from just under 3 minutes to nearly 10 minutes long, it never sounds uninteresting, which is exactly what Elfman wanted from the project. There's nothing really much to say about the Jack and Sally montage, because it's pretty much just the exact same performed by the Vitamin String Quartet. With just the strings, it's hard to emulate Elfman's whimsical style, so I think it does lose a little bit of flavour, but strings and horror go together like, well, Jack and Sally. Although the Sparkle Horse reimagining of Jack's obsession doesn't have the dynamic range of the original, it still captures that kind of sad feeling that starts off the song. But whereas the music takes a bit of a sinister turn once Jack has had his realisation, this new version stays consistently slow and melancholic. The folky whistles and softly plucked acoustic guitar keep a steady pace and consistent feeling of sadness. It's quite an interesting take on what could be something that's very easy to be overplayed as manic and frantic, but this stripped down, relaxing version feels light and soft, with amazing harmonies and instrumentation. Although it doesn't have the same momentum as the original, it's a really nice piece of music in and of itself. And then we come to something a bit less nice. Kidnap the Sandy Claus is arguably the most outright evil and cruel song on the entire soundtrack, with Lock, Shock and Barrel, these 3 trick-or-treating kids, singing about how they're going to torture and abuse an innocent man. The music sounds creepy and sinister, and the lyrics are pretty disturbing and violent, so with this being one of the darkest songs in the film, it deserved to be turned into one of the heaviest on Nightmare Revisited. In stepped Korn, a new metal band at the height of the scene during the film's resurgence in the mid-noughties. Jonathan Davis manages to perfectly capture the creepy, childlike la-la-las, and the pounding bass and eerie guitars turn up the sinister feel of the original even more. The only thing wrong with this track is that Jonathan has to perform all 3 voices at once, which could have been more effective if they'd have brought in other guests to feature as the other 2. But still, this became easily one of the standouts on the Revisited album, and even becoming a Korn fan favourite in its own right. And then we keep that energy up by going straight into Rise Against's spin on Making Christmas. Now, if I were to be pinning artists to certain songs, I wouldn't immediately think that this was a combination that would work, but the frantic nature of the original song seems perfect for a punk band with a known ability to make music that feels so driven. They throw in a few harmonies and overlapping guitar melodies that bring out the more ominous parts within the original, but can still slide effortlessly into the motifs that bring out the Christmassy themes, just like Elfman did. The double bass and galloping rhythm guitar ramp up the material to make that desperate rush to finish before Christmas Eve feel even more intense. Definitely another fan favourite from the Revisited album, and again, one that has found popularity within their own fan base as much as fans of the film. Nabbed feels almost unrecognisable from the original piece. It's nothing that really stands out, as it's just the score for the scene where Jack meets Sandy Claus for the first time. It uses a few other motifs like ones from Jack's Obsession and Sally's song to create an uneasy feel as background accompaniment, so it doesn't really get to have a standout moment of its own, except for an alternating brass motif at the end, which Yoshida Brothers ran with and created this weird 7.5 minute trippy piece that takes you from a classical Japanese shamisen to an electronic synthwave section, and constantly moves around using that one brass motif as an anchor to play around with. Not something that really stood out on a first listen, but it grows on you the more you notice the intricate parts at play, and the drastic shift in styles takes the most unique part of the original score and uses it to explore lots of traditional and contemporary elements of Japanese music and culture. Now, there are actually 2 versions of Oogie Boogie's song on Nightmare Revisited. The first one, which is treated as the official version they went with, is by Rodrigo and Gabriela, and their incredibly talented style of dueling Mexican acoustic guitar works surprisingly well here. This sounds absolutely nothing like the original, save for obviously the same riffs and motifs, but stylistically it allows the piece to become something completely new, and again an interesting reimagining. Then there's a bonus track by a band called Tiger Army, which is quite similar musically to the original. The voodoo ragtime style is rocked and jazzed up a bit, but the vocals are just so bland. Oogie is presented in the story of The Nightmare Before Christmas as the final villain. He's framed as this evil that even the creatures and monsters of Halloween Town are a little bit scared of. The mayor has to whisper his name out of fear, and Jack specifically tells Lock, Shock and Barrel not to involve him because he's dangerous and evil. He lives in a dungeon outside of town because nobody wants to be around him. He is the boogeyman. So naturally his song brings this gleefully evil character to life, as performed by the amazing Ken Page on the original soundtrack. Again, musically the Tiger Army version is quite similar, but the vocals steal all the life out of what is supposed to be a loud, bombastic villain song that's up there with the greats like Be Prepared. If it had been done with a sense of irony or juxtaposition, then it would work a bit better, but it just feels like it's trying to exist with a foot in both. All of the fun and emotion feel like it's been torn out. Sorry to go in so hard on Tiger Army here, but this is the track I'm most likely to skip. And now we come to what is really the most improved on song on the entire soundtrack. Catherine O'Hara's performance as Sally is amazing, but taking Sally's song and giving it to Amy Lee from Evanescence might just be the best decision to come out of this entire project. As we talked about earlier, Sally was a sort of icon for a lot of young girls who felt incomplete or overlooked, and her solo song is where she gets to open up about her inner turmoil, her anxiety about what is to come, and her unrequited feelings for Jack. So letting Amy Lee, an icon in her own right who really embodied the feelings of women and girls in the emo subculture, take on this piece in particular seems almost too perfect. Her haunting voice and the dark gothic music behind it turn this track into a powerful reflection of what exactly it was that young girls found within the character in the first place. It feels almost like this song was written to be performed this way. You really can't imagine a more perfect combination. The Christmas Eve montage is another piece of score music that could have just gone overlooked, but something great about the original is how it uses the music to inform the story. The beginning feels triumphant as Jack accomplishes his goal, and in many other films this is where the hero has his victory, but this isn't that kind of film, and so as things start to go wrong, the music falls seamlessly from a magical Christmas orchestral piece back into the dark and intimidating horror, and RJD2 manages to work both of these elements into a kind of synth-funk rock piece, with Pink Floyd guitars and groovy drum beats. The score pieces allow a lot more freedom to move around in the music and take some creative liberties to better suit whatever it is being transformed into. It feels similar enough to the original that it's recognisable, but also goes in some really strange but cool directions. I'm sorry, I just have to interject here, but are we going to talk about how Oogie Boogie definitely has a thing for feet? No? Okay, back to the music. Looking at this album on paper with which artist covered which songs, I don't think Plain White Tees would be top of anyone's list to cover Poor Jack, but it actually works really well. They stick close enough to the original that it can bring out the characterization of the lyrics, the pain in Jack's groans as he sees his mistakes, and the celebratory realization as he rediscovers his self-worth. They manage to make it still feel emotional and dynamic like the piece of musical theatre that it is, but are still able to put their own stamp on it. The simple acoustic guitar and soft bass backing allows the lyrics themselves to stand out. Rather than trying to change things for the sake of change, sometimes the best way to reimagine a song is to strip it down and let it speak for itself. To the Rescue is really the final action of the entire film, the final boss battle between Jack and Oogie, so the original score weaves together elements and instrumentation from both of their themes and motifs, with the two almost battling against each other themselves within the music, building tension. Each one sounds stylistically different so that you know there's a sort of call and response going on, even if you aren't really musically aware, but Data Rock turn it into this pounding techno rock beat, which at first sounds like it's going to go in a wildly different direction, but still manages to weave together that musical storytelling. The instrumentation is filled with twangy guitars, synths and upbeat drums that really drive the chaos and tension higher than the original. Finale Reprise is really just a combination of returning motifs from This Is Halloween, What's This and Sally's song, which gives closure to each smaller part of the story and wraps things up nicely. But Shiny Toy Guns take this and split the track up into three very distinguishable sections. First off, they hit us with one last big heavy track, starting with screams and big riffs and a huge symphonic organ that makes it feel a lot darker than the original. Then it flows into an open choral section with dreamy vocal harmonies and soft piano, before building back up into a powerful duet between a male and female voice, just like Jack and Sally, backed by triumphant brass and huge synths. These voices, like Jack and Sally's, complement each other really well, making it sound like the happy ending to an oddball love story. It's quite a powerful way to start to round out this journey that the album has been taking us on. Closing is similar to opening in the sense that the original was performed by Patrick Stewart on the soundtrack and re-recorded by Danny Elfman for the revisited version. There's not really much else to say about this because there's barely a difference between the two, but the album would feel incomplete without it. Maybe Elfman just wanted to put his own spin on this version of the soundtrack by having him bookend it instead. It was his passion project after all. The end titles track is again just a refrain of motifs from the film, using the themes of the main characters to wrap up the film nicely. The album leaf slows things down and creates a sort of soothing but melancholic tone that would feel at home over the credits of a modern thought-provoking film. Just look what happens if you add it into Oppenheimer, for example. Again, it's similar enough to the original that it doesn't feel jarring and fits the tone of the revisited album as a whole, rounding that out in its own particular way. It's not exactly the most exciting or interesting part of the album, but if you're doing a full album listen from cover to cover, it's not difficult to get swept up in it rather than skipping it as just the credits song. Overall, the two albums take the listener on very different journeys. The original soundtrack, while dark and full of that Elfman style of creepy wonder, is still fun and jovial. After all, it is still an animated family film, but the revisited album allows the artist to take different parts of the music to even more extreme places, from metal through to retro synth pop and orchestral jazz. Some of the reworkings take the material to places even darker and more sinister, with others stripping things down for a more relaxing feel. The listening experience of Revisited isn't just the same thing with different instruments. It's more dynamic, more exploratory, more free to play with genres, and the artists who were able to put their own stamp on these beloved tracks became part of the film's culture and fandom. The legacy of this project introduced fans of the film to some new artists they may never have heard of otherwise, and introduced fans of some of these artists to this strange cult classic film. Danny Elfman wanted to create something that celebrated the original film, and in that sense, Nightmare Revisited was every bit a success. Now, outside of Nightmare Revisited, there is one other cover that is worth looking at. YouTuber Jonathan Young, who you might know as the Disney metal guy, did a cover of Oogie Boogie's song, and my god, Jonathan Young brings this to life so much better than either of the versions on Nightmare Revisited. It feels scary, it feels dark and twisted. Just listen to this. Now you might be asking why I'm bringing this up when it has nothing to do with Nightmare Revisited, and that's because this version makes me realise just how wasted the potential was with the two versions that were included. Rodrigo and Gabriella are incredibly talented musicians, and I'm sure Tiger Army are too. But this was an opportunity to turn one of the most sinister songs on the original soundtrack into a truly terrifying, disturbing piece of music. Personally, I'd take both of those versions out of a playlist and add Jonathan Young's version in instead. While working on this video, I also discovered that on the Japanese release, there's another bonus version of Sally's song by Scott Murphy, which transforms the piece into an upbeat anime intro sung entirely in Japanese. It's definitely a lot of fun to listen to, and might have actually been really enjoyable if it was part of the main album, but Amy Lee still has this one locked down. If they were to ever make something like this again, and do an updated version with current contemporary artists, I think there's a lot of potential they could work with. Obviously in the modern alt scene, if you say horror, you'd likely think Ice Nine Kills could do a song, or Ghost, or Creeper, but I'd love to see Sleep Token's take on Poor Jack. But Danny Elfman was a massive influence on Avenged Sevenfold. Songs like A Little Piece of Heaven took a huge inspiration from him, and it would be really nice to see things come full circle and give them a chance to cover something like Oogie Boogie's song, something weird and experimental with that heavy gothic flavour. Or Bill Murray's rock-jazz hybrid with saxophones and big guitars could be really interesting as well. But who do you think would make a great cover for any of the songs on The Nightmare Before Christmas? And what's your favourite from Nightmare Revisited? Now it's time to answer the age-old question, is The Nightmare Before Christmas a Halloween film or a Christmas film?